Is it possible to cut your hate in half? Author Dan Stone makes the case for bridging our political divides and enhancing public discourse. He'll be in town next Saturday, November 16th, as part of the TEDx Jacksonville 2024 conference, and he joins me now by phone. Dan Stone, good morning.
Good morning.
So it seems like a timely conversation to be talking about this election week, but when did you start considering this topic?
I have been thinking about this topic for quite a while, actually. Yeah, I have been doing research on polarization and emotional polarization for really for over 10 years now. So polarization has been building up for decades now. It's not just a Trump era phenomenon.
Yeah.
So I've been working on it and thinking about it for a while. Yeah.
So you are chair of the economics department at Bowdoin College. You're a behavioral economist, which, quite frankly, is something I didn't even know existed until a couple of months ago when I heard somebody on the radio who was one. But explain what it means to be a behavioral economist.
Sure. Yeah. So behavioral economics is the area of economics that incorporates psychology and tries to make economic theory and models sort of more psychologically realistic. So that's what it is in a nutshell. I could, economics traditionally did not incorporate a lot of psychology, even though, of course, a lot of economic decision making does involve psychology. Behavioral econ sort of brings those fields together.
And so, I mean, my understanding is that we expect people to behave rationally when it comes to economic decisions, but that when you put our behavior through a behavioral lens, very often our decisions around economic issues really aren't very rational, and sometimes very rash or impulsive.
Yeah, so I think people have very different opinions on the extent to which they would agree with your statement that people are expected to behave rationally. But I think even behavioral economists recognize that most people make pretty reasonable decisions most of the time and trying to identify, and we're far from perfect, of course, and so we also make mistakes all the time. But a lot of the mistakes are sort of idiosyncratic and random and they sort of cancel out in some ways. We get lucky with some decisions and unlucky with others. And the hard thing to do is to figure out sort of systematic patterns in decisions which are not so rational, which actually maybe make ourselves worse off in the long run. And we found a number of patterns that doesn't, these things do, of course, indeed happen, but documenting them is not so easy.
So, part of what you look at are things like cognitive bias, and you have found an overlap, obviously, in the world of our political views and our political interactions. So, explain a little bit about how you got into that particular area of study and what generally you have found.
Sure, sure. Right. So even behavioral economists don't typically study politics, though a lot of them do nowadays. So I started off in this area actually studying media. So media, a lot of media, of course, is produced by private for-profit firms. So it's more of a natural topic for economists to study. And going back a decade or two, economists began to recognize that a lot of media content, of course, is influenced by psychological forces, right? The media content, which is potentially profit maximizing, is the content that appeals to people for psychological reasons. So there are natural connections to psychology and behavioral economics there.
Just a quick question: Are you
So
talking? Are you talking about news media in particular?
yeah, I'm sorry, yeah, news media. So cable news, all types of news media, newspapers, cable news, and then the internet media is its own world, of course. So there's about a couple decades ago the question of media bias sort of started to get a lot of attention. And one of the questions economists looked at is in what sense can we actually scientifically measure whether different types of media outlets are biased, and then why would they be biased? Why would private potentially profit maximizing firms find it profitable to offer bias? That sounds like an unprofitable thing to do. And so I started working on that, and then that's naturally connected to the broader question of polarization more broadly. So media firms having incentives to offer information which is potentially skewed in one direction or the other is closely related to this broader issue of people having polarized beliefs about political issues.
I mean, when you say closely related, I mean, I'm guessing that you found that there is economic motivation for these companies to provide some sort of bias in the coverage that they provide. But when you're talking about the connection then to polarization in society, are you saying that that is there for causing that kind of political polarization?
So the cause and effect goes both directions. So polarization, like I said, it goes back decades. And as news consumers generally become more polarized, as our ideologies and beliefs spread apart, that is going to create demand for different types of news and cause more ideologically differentiated news, so to speak, or more polarized news to become more appealing to the news firms. And then, of course, as you provide people with information which confirms their existing beliefs and tells them they're right, they're going to be even more confident in those beliefs and be even less interested in news from different viewpoints. So there's a feedback process where both things grow.
Hmm.
And then around even just 10 years ago, it wasn't just me, especially in political science, people started to realize that we're not just polarized in terms of our beliefs about policy issues, things like climate change and taxes and immigration and stuff, but we're really emotionally polarized in the sense that we have grown to increasingly dislike people we disagree with politically and feel more coldly toward those we disagree with. And again, there's sort of cause and effect in both directions there, where the more we disagree on issues with people, the more we're going to dislike them. But also, the more we dislike the other side, the less likely we are to trust them, the less likely we are to want to listen to their opinions on the issues, to want to compromise with them. So this emotional aspect was something that I and a bunch of others, not so many in economics. 10 years ago, there are more and more people in economics recognizing the importance of what we call affective polarization, which is emotional polarization.
Yeah, I want to
Even in
talk a little bit.
economics, that's
I want to talk more
yeah.
about that in a minute. But you coined this term "undue hate." Explain to me, what is that? This is like a tendency to assume the worst.
Yeah. So that is a term that I use to refer to extreme hostility, dislike, maybe even hate, that is essentially unjustified. It's based on false beliefs. That's based on beliefs about who it is that you're hating that are not that are either factually incorrect or they're not justified based on the information you have available to you. So I'm not going so. I mean, as an economist, I'm a little reluctant to make claims on whether what should be hated in general and what should be loved. I'm a little agnostic about that. I'm not going so far as to say we should never hate anything, but I am going so far as to say that if you hate X or person, if you hate Joe because you think Joe hates puppies and Joe actually loves puppies, then you feel undue hate towards Joe. Your hate is not justified based on who Joe really is
I
and
mean,
even
can
the
you think of
information you have.
a political example that would apply in this case?
Yeah, so there are tons of examples in America today where Democrats and Republicans have beliefs about the other side which are essentially too pessimistic. So a big one is that even though we truly have become more emotionally polarized, both sides feel more coldly toward the other than they did decades ago. Both sides actually overestimate how much they are disliked by the other party. So scale 0 to 100, say Democrats give Republicans a 20. That's pretty low, right? A warm feeling scale. This is where a higher number would mean that you feel more warmly toward the other side. A lower number is more cold. So say we give our own party an 80 and we give the other party a 20. That's pretty bad. Well, we actually think that the other side would only give us a 10. We actually are too pessimistic about how they feel toward us. So even though they do feel pretty cold, they don't feel as hostile as we think they do. And if they and we think that they hate us, that makes us hate them, right? We don't like to be hated. So the perception that we're hated feeds into our own hostility toward them, and so overestimating their hatred does it.
Yeah, interesting. If
Um,
I just
there's a
want to
bunch of
break
other
and
evidence.
I
Yeah.
just want to take a break here and say if you're just joining us, we are talking to Dan Stone about trying to mitigate hate in the political sphere. You can join our conversation at 904-549-2937. You can email comments or questions to First Coast Connect at wjct.org, or you can tag us on social media. I'm sorry, Dan, go ahead. What were you going to say there?
Oh, no problem at all. So I was going to say there are other examples I could talk about, but I don't want to go on and on unless you'd like me to.
Well, let's talk about, we're talking about subjective feelings, right? As a behavioral economist, how are you able to demonstrate that they're objectively wrong, if you're talking about a subjective sense?
Right, right. So I don't want to make any claims about what people should or shouldn't like, but what we can do is assess the accuracy of beliefs about observable features of the other side. So if, like I was just saying, if I don't want to be hated, and I think, suppose I'm a Democrat and you're Republican, and I think you hate me, and then we ask you, how do you feel about me? And you actually say, I wouldn't say I hate, I strongly dislike. If hearing that makes me say, okay, well, I don't mind you too much either. If having my beliefs about you be corrected makes me feel more warmly towards you, that shows that my initially strong feelings of dislike or whatever were based on a misperception. And so even by my own standards of whatever it is I decide to like or dislike you on, by those standards, I was disliking you too much. I was disliking you based on a false perception of who you are. So if we can show that when we correct people's misperceptions, that causes them to warm up to the other side, that means that their initial coldness was based on a misperception, even given their own subjective criteria for deciding how to feel cold or warm toward others.
So I know that we're talking about this in the context of political polarization. It's something that you began looking at through the lens of news media and how they were presenting information and whether they benefited by inserting bias. But have you been able to objectively ascertain whether there are actually these large differences between groups of people that politically disagree, or whether those are perhaps smaller differences than we perceive and are just amplified to make us think that we are farther apart than we are?
Yeah, so there certainly are big differences, but there are also big misunderstandings. So that's perhaps my optimistic take is to focus on the misunderstandings and the ways that we are not as far apart as we think that we are, and there are plenty of examples of that. So I think given that we're all looking for ways to make progress, and not just in terms of getting along for the sake of getting along, but in terms of governing the country more effectively and actually just general productivity, we need to figure out how to overcome these misperceptions. So there are plenty of misperceptions, but there are plenty of real divides too. I'm not denying that.
We've got a question from Robert in St. Augustine, I think, with like a question about a practical application. Robert, go ahead. Are you there, Robert? I'm going to put you on hold, Robert. Um, so when it comes to like strategies or tactics, are there exercises people can do to, I don't know, change the way that they're perceiving how much they're hated by other people, or perhaps mitigate how much animosity they feel towards people on the other side of the political spectrum? Like actual kind of advice or suggestions of
Sure,
behavior modification.
sure. So I'm going to talk about that sort of thing next week. So I don't want to, give too much away. I'm really excited to talk about it at the TEDx conference, which is it's going to be awesome. The organizers have done a great job, and the other speakers look amazing. But in a nutshell, I'm going to focus on the idea that we should question our beliefs more than we're intuitively inclined to, that we should remember that we generally don't know as much as we think we do. We should accept uncertainty and just remember that when we think we know something, we might not. And I'm going to use other words to talk about this basic idea, and it turns out to, it almost sounds like common sense, the idea that we don't know as much as we think that we do. But there are a lot of subtleties to it, and there's a lot of complexity. But ultimately, the main recommendation is to embrace uncertainty while also recognizing that there are times where we can justifiably become confident in our beliefs when our confidence is based on valid evidence. So, not saying never be totally nihilistic and just say I don't know about everything. But in general, when we learn a fact which seems to imply that someone we disagree with is horrible, remember that there's probably much more to the story than we think there is. There's just so many examples and so many studies supporting this as a broad general phenomenon.
I want to take a call from John in Riverside. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Good morning. What I wanted to say about this was, traditionally you didn't discuss religion or politics. It wasn't going to go anywhere. You're just going to cause problems. And so, but today social media puts our religious and our political feelings out in front. That's how we're interacting with everybody. I'm a member of a club that does not allow discussion of politics because it'll only break it up. So I have a friend from there that I've known for 18 months. We've talked about other things. We went on a retreat last week, and during that time, he kept bringing up his political beliefs. Now, I already like this individual, and I admire certain things about him. He was there with his wife who had some health problems. He was very doting. I admired the marriage they had. But today, so I learned his politics after I had an impression of him. We don't get this chance anymore because the algorithms on social media can get more clicks if they put us together with people we know and put what we disagree about out front. The other thing is the anonymity. The things you can say on social media are things that people would never say or they used to not say face to face. But I don't think we can underestimate that there are forces trying to make us fight for the sake of clicks. Thank you, John.
Dan, your thoughts about that?
I think those are great points. Absolutely. It's much easier to talk about politics after we've gotten to know whoever it is we're talking to, and we've earned their trust, and we've grown to trust them. Then if they say something we disagree with politically, we think, okay, well, who knows? Maybe there's more to this than I had thought before, or, okay, I disagree with them, but I know they're not a bad guy overall. And yes, we're at our worst on social media for other reasons, and so social media is part of the story. It's not what I'm going to talk about next Saturday. Is social media has gotten a ton of attention, of course, on social media and in the news, and I'm actually going to talk about connections between political polarization and polarization and other types of relationships, like even husbands and wives and neighbors and brothers. And I'm going to talk about general psychological forces that can cause people to become too emotionally polarized. But I completely agree with the caller's points. Social media is part of the story. It's not the whole story at all. This polarization trend started before social media. It goes back to about 1980, and it's been trending up at a steady pace since then in the U.S.
Interesting.
So it's not just social media. Yeah.
I want to take a call from Brittany in Putnam County. Good morning, Brittany. Go ahead.
Good morning. My biggest question, I guess, or my concern is that do you see this polarization going away in the future? I have a lot of friends and a lot of people in my kind of community or area that have shared and have expressed thoughts that align with, the conservative party and some of Trump's rallies and things that are just the most horrible and horrific things you could say about people. But when I see the kind of rhetoric that I would put out, okay, hey, you're conservative, I think you're an idiot for voting, or I think you're this, but the other side is, that we're demonic and we should be slaughtered or destroyed. I mean, is that kind of polarization going to go away, or is it going to trend and make it worse? I mean, I've talked to people who I've been friends with for years, and that's the kind of rhetoric they share about liberals, Democrats, people on the left, and I just don't see that from the other side. Do you think it's an even keel here? I don't, I would never wish anything that horrible on somebody, but now it seems to be in our faces every day, and it was for years, and we've been, dealing with that, people on the left and Democrats for years. So I just want to get your thoughts on something that, if it really is that severe, or, but yes, thank you. I appreciate you taking my call.
Thanks, Brittany. Dan, I mean, what if people don't see parity, as Brittany mentions, from one side to the other in terms of the level of rhetoric?
Yeah, so I think there are some real differences between the parties and supporters of both parties. In terms of the data, there are a lot of similarities in terms of general feelings of hostility and general misperceptions. I would say for the rhetoric, which seems the very worst, we need to be careful to not there will be examples of this, and it's natural to, when we hear about examples of this, to think that those examples are more representative of the other side than they really are. So, watch the news, and you're going to hear about, the very worst, the very most extreme things happening in the world. You're not going to hear about more general representation. So, just be careful not to extrapolate too much from the most extreme things. The caller, also asked about sort of what's going to happen in the future. Is this going to get worse or better? And this is, such a hard thing to predict. And so one of my recommendations would be to be very wary of anyone who does claim to be able to predict it. We've been in a pretty steady pattern of just sort of generally increasing polarization over the last few decades. So one thought would be that it would take some sort of major paradigm-changing event for us to change course. And in the absence of that, things are not going to change fundamentally. But there are scholars and people working in this area who think that maybe we peaked and that things are going to turn around. And I'll just throw out the name of one guy who's doing interesting work who claims that. His name is Matt Burgess, Burgess. Not saying I endorse everything that he's written and said, but he makes a really interesting case that polarization is turning around, or so it's worth checking out.
All right. We got an email from Judy, and she's saying, regarding contrasting political parties, it's more than just thinking we know something when a powerful party develops and passes laws that affect the everyday lives of targeted persons. So, I guess she's saying there's more than just maybe a perception of a disagreement if you feel
Right.
that you're in a group where laws are being passed that are going to personally affect you.
Right. So sometimes our perceptions are indeed completely accurate. So I'm not claiming that all of the negativity is based on misperception, but there's evidence that a lot of it is. And there's also it's very possible to misinterpret one fact as meaning more than it does to assume that, say, a particular law that we're strongly opposed to or that hurts us personally is supported by more of the other side than it is, or that their reasons for supporting the law are worse, they're more malicious than they really are, something like that. So even when we have a very clear understanding of one particular issue or fact or law, it's possible we don't understand the bigger picture as well as we do. In fact, I would say it's likely that we don't understand the bigger picture as well as we intuitively think.
So just briefly, before we wrap, you talk about something that you refer to as intellectual humility. Explain what that is and how that could factor into reducing political polarization.
Right. So that's related to what I was saying earlier about accepting uncertainty and also reminding ourselves that things are more complicated than we think most of the time. It's being humble about our beliefs. It's and it means instead of saying I know this is going to happen, saying I think this is going to happen. It means being open to hearing other people's points of view, not just to be polite, but because we think we might actually learn something. It means not being afraid to change our beliefs because we think that it will make us look like we were wrong before or look like we're too easily persuaded. But we should, but recognizing that everyone is always in a state of learning or should be in a state of learning. So we should all be adjusting our beliefs well. Again, being careful not to adjust too much. So we have to find that sweet spot where we're not stuck in the mud, but also not reacting to every new piece of info we stumble across.
Right. Well,
Yeah.
he's the author of Undue Hate, a behavioral economic analysis of hostile polarization in U.S. politics and beyond. And he's speaking at the TEDx Jax 2024 conference on Saturday, November 16th at UNF. Dan Stone, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. This was a great conversation.